Okay, 23 October. Welcome to this
Hello. Oh, are you talking?
and that. We begin. Gravity, this and that. But today's moderately important because I know I said yesterday that I was going to try and do, or 2 days ago, said I was going to try and do nothing but book reviews or other things that were less pivotal to stuff I'm working on. But actually, as we were discussing the thing yesterday, um, certain ideas came up that I probably should have dealt with, and then I went back in and tried to sort of figure out, well, what did I mean by that? And so it turned out that it got me back onto some original thinking and stuff I hadn't cleared up yet. So I'm going to do some of that today. Using a couple of works on and by Christopher Arthur, and it sits in a certain place. That is the idea of value form theory, and I have not read enough, and it's unfortunate to admit that, but there's a whole bunch of stuff I haven't gotten around to reading yet. The recently published, for example, Michael Heinrich dissertation of 1991, which has only recently been translated into English, which is actually a pivotal text for all of his work, translating and interpreting Marx, particularly on the value form issue, I think. So I'm going to get onto that. And then I came across a new book, yet another book published a couple of years ago, which I should have read, but I never got to, or I knew about it and couldn't access it until today. Now I have access to it. It's not a very long book, but it probably is really complicated because it's by somebody who's actually trying to determine the difference between Zlazov and Zizek, which is even more crazy. But anyway, that's all for some other discussion. Anyway, as I said, two articles, one by Chris Arthur on value form and Marx, and working through our Department 1, Department 2 issue, and more specifically on an issue which is fundamental to the thing we haven't really gotten to yet, and that is the latest translation of Marx's Capital Volume 1, which I'm still trying to work the technical issues out, which is not impossible. It's just weird for whatever reason. And we'll look at that. And not having read it, I need to sort of work through some of the ideas there. I have an inkling about the ideas since I have read some stuff by the two editors and translators, the two Pauls, which I introduced a couple days ago. So all of that is in the same place. That is the two Pauls, the new the new translation of Volume 1, which just came out a couple weeks ago. The article on Chris Arthur, the article by Chris Arthur, and some other things. And I hope you'll get the sense of that as I go through this today. Actually, this is kind of an important one to record because this should sort of determine what things I'm going to look at for the next couple of weeks. And I think I have that all kind of squared away now. And we'll see. Tomorrow, the Thursday, today's Wednesday, tomorrow's Thursday, and I may or may not play the audiobook, the second half hour of 3 half hours of City of Quartz, because I don't know whether people are really reading it or not, and whether discussion is going to move in that direction, or whether I'll just return to something else. So that's kind of up in the air. Needless to say, it's an important moment in the world, particularly since we're still talking about Nazis, which is all the more interesting. You will recall months ago, I guess, I introduced some idea of trying to look at the sort of critical intersection of three kinds of concepts that hitherto now have not truly been integrated for a variety of reasons, some of which is because some people don't like to analyze or to look too analytically or overturn the analytic analysis of Marx. It could be simply that there's just, there's no limit to jargon in the post-war 21st century context. But I'm going to continue to do this, and I really don't care about criticism of this because this is kind of where I am. And so 3 concepts: sublation, which is a underlying a thing that connects both Hegel and Marx; valorization, which not mentioned enough, perhaps in the Marx context, probably a little bit more by Engels, but is an underlying and key element for some new approaches to Marx, particularly on the issue, or at least for me, of eco-socialism; and indexicality, which is an idea that fits into certain linguistic approaches, structural approaches, post-structural approaches to Marx, and which has been perhaps thoroughly negated or criticized by a variety of folks, but I think doesn't lose its force. So it is about certain types of transformation, and the underlying transformation, which I want to look at today, is that moment which we were just discussing yesterday, this issue of the movement, Department 1, Department 2, production, circulation or consumption, distribution, however you want to call Department 2, and the relationship of money to commodities. Now, that all seems relatively simple, but it's not that simple, and it is a lot of ink's been spilled over what happens when commodities are created and what is money's relationship to that. That is money as a commodity form. And while that is simple for some of us who've really looked at it, other people doesn't seem quite so obvious, but it actually, I think it really is. And you just need to think about it a little bit harder. So certain transformations are going on in the sublation context. It is about preserving a negation, leading to a new form. This is, in its final version, probably is about as the Frankfurt School books talk about, the negation of the negations, and the third element of a dialectical approach. A negative dialectic, as they say. Second is valorization, that is assigning value, which can change. And it's always about valorization, that is valorization in the first moment, but valorization in multiple moments, that is in multiple transformations in a market, in appraisal, if you were talking about artwork, for example, or houses, in real estate. All of those things are part of that. It is dependent on context, just like sublation is. And the example, of course, that I had Gemini pull up for me is a painting might be more valuable to an art collector than to someone who doesn't appreciate art. And that's pretty much the case of value crises in late modern capitalism, particularly when stupid people exist. But, that's the way it is. Indexicality, meaning depends on context. So there's a dependency in that particular sense. Messages are being produced. Messages are usually attached to some kind of meaning, even a meaning that is absent, because the absence of meaning is a presence, not to get too horrible about that, but it is context dependent in that sense. Here and now have different meanings depending on who is speaking and when. So this has to do with not just simply thinking about it, but also performing it in terms of the language. That is orally. So there's some connection between thinking and speaking, and whether those things are combined or not. And I won't do my whole little lecture on speech acts on that. So the idea that we were sort of fiddling with yesterday was the abstract notion, the idea of abstraction, abstract labor, etc. And certainly it is a metaphor producing process, right? We use lots of all kinds of stupid metaphors, and metaphors have a functionality, of course, but they also, it has not only a practical application or is applied context dependent, but it also has a form and a shape and a variety of other things. The metaphor means an analogy and a connection between two different objects or ideas. And, the difference between objects and ideas is obviously the problematic element of Marxism itself. And in terms of a material world or an ideal world, and then you go back to Hegel, blah, blah, blah. Now, this second notion this is from somebody else's PowerPoint. It depends on the scripting, the signs in the particular context. What is interesting that this is from some work being done by a variety of folks who are integrating semiotic analysis and coding. That is, the human human-computer interface is actually one of these kinds of problems. In terms of a graphic user interface, but at a deeper level, the coding level. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just saying that there is a connection here. It's worth studying. It's worth studying in the complex way relative to digital currency, for example, or NFTs or whatever. But we're not going to talk about that today. Well, we could, but we're not. And so this is an integration of that kind of set of ideas. And of course, adding semiotics may mean something, sort of tedious and jargon related and blah, 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 too theoretical. You should just suck it up, as they say. An action can mean something. That is, you have a signifier. The four-legged animal that goes woof, for example, has a variety of signified. It's Fido, it's my friend, my best friend, the memories of my previous best friends, etc. So it is all of those things. But if we're thinking about breakfast, the alternative kind of breakfast you happen to like now, and then there's metaphorical scripting going on. How would I describe it? Sweet, sour, bad for me, cholesterol filled, whatever. And so there is the action or the thing itself, and then the things that we attribute to it, the things that are signified by it. Now, this compares in that simple example of breakfast above. It is something that is more singular, not necessarily perfectly singular. So in terms of money, there is money. There is the commodity, the money commodity, which is not money itself. Because money could be a bunch of things. Could be IOUs, could be gold, could be silver, whatever. And then there's the question that Marx raises, and that is, how is it that we get from these particulars to the universal? That is universal money. And, therein lies the issue, right? Does money measure value? Does it represent price? Why is it always moving around? Why do people call it, whine about inflation when in fact it's, there's not much you can do about it. But of course, that's the excuse that the average voter will make relative to rationalizing their vote, which, signifies a whole bunch of other things that we don't need to get into. But needless to say, money relates to a means of circulation, not a means of production. The means of production would be a printing press, for example. The means of production would be digging out there looking for gold and having some bandito tell me, I don't got to show you no stinking badges, whatever, or badges. So there is a difference between credit money and concrete money in that particular context. So there is concrete and abstract relations going on. And I haven't changed the position of whatever I've said before. I've just simply been applying a kind of layer on it, and you have to go all the way back to the yammering that I started with. But nothing has changed, even though you may think stuff has changed. The world really hasn't changed. The sign is an arbitrary thing. It can be denotated, that is, with a specific thing, like the 5 letters called Apple, or pronounced as Apple. I suppose it could be pronounced Apple, whatever, or Apple. It is, regardless, whether it's an image, sound, or word, it's a signifier. And there are contexts. Remember, I talked about contexts above. Conceptual, perceptual, and cultural contexts are some versions of that. And then I have cognition, right? Connotation, right? So there's one way in which an apple means something. Could mean Macintoshes. Macintoshes, the fruit that I bought at the supermarket yesterday. Or the computer, which still costs 3 times as much as something else that I could use for computing. But that's kind of the difference, right? The difference between things that exist in a more metaphoric way and things that exist in a concrete reality. Now, I refer you back to where I started years ago. Now, it's years ago. The Harry Cleaver version of Capital Volume 1, his notes. And his notes and our diagram is, it it may not have changed, but it is worth still talking about because he defines or diagrams a certain structure to Volume 1 of Capital. And he refers to it as a structure of argument. And this structure of argument, like Marx's writing itself, corresponds to it. For me anyway, it's the easiest way to read Marx because it's the perfect, it does idiographically what what Volume 1 does, maybe what Chapter 1 does. But anyway, regardless, and as I said, I haven't read the Paul 1 and Paul 2's book yet. So I haven't gotten to whatever critique I might have or elaboration, which might be amplified, and I will hopefully be the better for it, and from which I will generate a review article, which hopefully will get published somewhere, or else I'll cause lots of trouble, particularly on the left, and get into little tedious, tolerably tedious scholastic fights with people, which, I'm amused by, but in a patronizing and condescending way. But the fact is, that sort of comes with the territory and only reveals, it reveals one's limits. And as Dirty Harry says, a person has to know their limitations. Anyway, so in the Cleaver case, we begin with the commodity, as Marx does. We distinguish between use values and exchange values. We understand that there is, at least from a labor theory value point of view, a socially necessary labor time, SNLT. And yes, there's other ways of talking about it, but let's just assume that there's a way among many of talking about socially necessary labor time without getting too deep into it. The distinguishing between concrete labor and abstract labor, the idea that you could have, in fact, as a form of exchange value, which is still the key element, it's still there. It's not negated. It is emphasized, in fact, by people like Heinrich in terms of the value form problem. So you have forms, an equivalent form, something that corresponds directly, not unlike a signifier, and you have a relative form, not unlike the arbitrary, like apples, that apples could be this flat thing that costs $1,000, and works okay, more or less. But I can buy 3 or 4 Wintel laptops for the same amount of money. Anyway, and then there is the equivalent and relative form, and then the money form, which is another way of trying to universalize this, right? To say, okay, there are these things, and I want to buy one. I want one, and so what if somebody else who has it? That's a form of property. How do I get it from them short of killing them, or whatever? Throwing money at them might be one way of doing it. So there's the money form. So you go money form here to money form here, the social relations between things and the material relation between persons, and you can know that it is about objects and people and other things. This exists in a market, because that's what happens. Although, one extreme form of market exchange is my, getting out a gun and, performing social banditry or whatever. But so there is a general difference between sellers and buyers. There is the money commodity. That's, as the market operates, right? If you see commodity forms because you see a set of abstract and concrete relations being sort of processed, that, And so there is, you have the money as a medium of circulation. That's the thing itself. And of course, if you have a credit card, it's not quite so thing-like anymore. And it is a measure of value. That is, if you agree that, that's what dollars are about. If you're stupid and believe you're a sovereign citizen and you can make up your own money, well, that's a whole different deal. But anyway, money is the result of these sort of concrete elements and abstract elements of money as a commodity, and that's money. Now we follow money down here in the little Cleaver diagram to the thing that probably is the distinguishing characteristic for 21st century analysis, and one that relates to our interest in financialization, and that is debtors versus creditors. And so this is a value problem because it is about capital. It is not about money itself, but it is rather a whole bunch of other things that are being measured. This even more abstract idea about value and what is it worth in exchange? And of course, the question of equivalence. Is profit identical or not identical to surplus value? Another way of talking about it, but as labor theory of value suggests, and is not the absolute be-all and end-all of the problem, but one version of value, of course, says, well, surplus value has something to do with some sort of exploitation or expropriation or some estrangement or some alienation or some taking away of something or whatever. And so all of that is in there. And if you buy into a labor power argument, it is slightly more abstract because of that. And then there's buying and selling of labor power, and hence a division between capital and labor. And then ultimately at the end of volume one, it's class struggle, antagonisms, however you want to look at it. Some people fixate on the class question. I think that's because Marx, you could see classes, right? There are people who can travel around in gold coaches, and then there's people who don't have to walk. There's other, the divisions are clearly there, and the antagonisms are clearly there, and you have to decide, not unlike Marx, not unlike a whole bunch of folks relative to revolutions, what to do. All right, so hopefully you followed that up to now, and that's kind of where we were several years ago and sort of looking at this. So there's the current problem is, of course, a discussion problem from yesterday, and continues on. And well, what is Marx's value theory? What's the source of profit? These are just general questions. These have no absolute answers, which is interesting, but whatever. How can a capitalist purchase all inputs and sell all outputs at competitive prices and yet make a profit? So in a simple question, it has certain absolute criteria, but on the other hand, it's kind of weirdly relative and variable. So to understand this need, you need to look at this question. You need to look at the essential level of values. Well, now, what is the essential? And that is what's going to become problematic, as we'll see downhill. Initially, Marx assumes prices equal values. This is an assumption he later relaxes, and he does this because he's looking at the history of classical political economy. He's looking at other people on this same issue. Other people are looking at the other people that he's been looking at. So that's kind of where we are in the 21st century, is looking at, people from the 20th century who are trying to figure this out. People of the 19th century are trying to figure this out, and then trying to see it applied in a variety of new contexts, all of which operates at the same time because, that's kind of the world. All right. So the first edition of the first volume of Capital contains an appendix, an Anhang, entitled the value form, the Wertform, and this was dropped in the second edition. Here we are in the bibliographic, the bibliological, the philological kind of approach to Marx, and yes, it is that intense, and it is about literature in that particular context. But it is not simply purely about literature or writing or social science in that fact, or philosophy. It's all of those things which make it a little more complicated for people. But if you learned enough, you don't see this as daunting. It just kind of how you have to work. Most of the material being worked into the rewritten version of Chapter 1. Now, I don't want to go into the bibliography of it. You can listen to Heinrich yak about this, but a lot of stuff gets written, gets added and subtracted, and that's the way the nature of Marxian manuscripts. And there's lots of stuff there. And the problem for some scholars is that they fixate on it like it's the gold, the Sierra Madre gold. And unfortunately, banditos will come up and tell you they don't have stinking budgets. So this is an important problem. You have to sort of work through this and go, Okay, it's still there, but it's less apparent. It got blown away by the wind. The origins and nature of this appendix are elucidated in the Marx-Engels correspondence during June 1867, sorry. Engels was reading the page proofs of the first volume of Capital. On 16 June 1867, remember 1867 is an important year. It's sort of the last year, well, we'll argue this. It's probably the last year is sort of focusing on kind of the key elements, particularly the front end of Capital. And yes, there's a controversy. Yes, there's other issues. And yes, we can talk about it later. He wrote to Marx, Engels, writing to Marx, saying, amongst other things, the second sheet especially bears rather strong marks of your carbuncles. And yes, we can go all the way about that. But that cannot be altered now, and I don't think you should do anything more about it in an addendum, for after all, the Philistine, yes, the stupid people, is not accustomed to this sort of abstract thought, and certainly will not cudgel his brains for the sake of the form of value. So now I got to sort of, hopefully you're still with me on the beginning of this. Now we get to the first article by Jim Kincaid on Chris Arthur and Marx's value theory. And I know this sounds like an article about an article about an article and then about Marx. But in fact, kind of that's what you have to do. It just doesn't, it's not as easy as you think. So in this, he's describing Chris Arthur's value form argument. He's written a whole article on this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we move further. Marx starts by positing a deep opposition between the use value and the exchange value of a commodity and the material practices of exchange. A real process of abstraction is going on in which the use value of commodities are being treated as irrelevant and the commodity reduced to quantities of value. Commodities are being turned into nothing more than forms. This is the difference between forms and something essential, right? So there's appearance and essence that make up a form in the Hegelian context. So sort of get used to that idea, and it's arbitrary. In Arthur's account, Marx introduces use value only to immediately set it aside. The focus of the early chapters of Capital Volume 1 is exclusively on exchange value, which is treated as a pure form. Now, that's packed into a whole bunch of different ways you can go with that, but just sort of assume that as a heuristic, just sort of accept that for the moment. When heterogeneous material characteristics of commodities are absent from their identity as values, what is so constituted is form as such. That is a pure form of exchangeability. So the point here is to sort of focus on the process, the distributional aspects, not the production. It is to talk a little bit more ephemerally. And Arthur argues, here is the decisive importance of Hegel's logic for Marx's project in Capital. Marx wants to trace a process whereby the empty value forms actualize themselves into a self-sustaining totality as a functioning capitalist system. Hegel's book deals with philosophical and scientific thinking as a system, a totality which is constructed through a chain of necessary arguments. Note that what Cleaver was doing was a chain of necessary arguments as well. It is a self-sufficient system of thought because it is circular. That is, the starting point of the whole argument is validated retrospectively by the later development of the argument. In other words, you start with the commodity, you get the class struggle, and then you're back to commodities again. Value form theory argues that logical movement of Hegel's thought, just because it's idealist and deals with metaphysical processes, is just what is needed for explaining a system in which the pure forms of value take over and control material processes of production and ensure the reproduction of value as capital and its increase via extraction of surplus value. All of that explains Department 2. I mean, you could argue that it does. I mean, it explains the whole thing, but Department 2 is about, well, I want to buy crap because, I want it, whatever that means, because somebody else has it and I want it. Now I could steal it from the other person, or I could make money and buy it. And, that's kind of the Trumpian view of the world. Anyway, Arthur sees in Capital the story of a massive reversal of fortune. Note what a reversal of fortune might actually be. At the start, value is presented as a mere empty form, one whose existence is like that of a specter, a ghost, right? And I won't go at great length about this, but this spectral kind of existence is actually very important. And he mentions it at the front end. And of course, it gains, there's whole stuff built on, the fictitiousness, the specter of capital, in Europe and blah, blah, blah. Here, Arthur draws on Derrida's study of ghosts in Marx, and there's a whole thing there. It's called hauntology and blah, blah, blah. All right, back. Value then starts a process of making itself real by taking possession of commodities in and through the exchange process. That's what Halloween is. Anyway, by transforming itself first into the form of money and then into money capital. As this money capital is used to purchase labor and means of production, value is able to grow by the extraction and accumulation of surplus value. Two key moves encapsulate the distinctiveness of Chris Arthur's approach. He resumes and develops a line of thinking initiated by Roy Bhaskar, in which Hegel's logical category of negation is redefined as absenting, all right? Presence and absence, right? As absenting. A real social process in which what has been made absent is held to be a determinate nothing, as opposed to just a nothing. As an example, considering the phrase, Jane is no longer there. Dave's not here, man. What has replaced Jane is not nothing, but what Hegel calls a determinate nothing. That is a Jane-shaped emptiness, absence defined by the previous presence of Jane. Now, you can, read it, project into this all you like, and yes, Lacan could be engaged here, but, just stay with me. Marx says that there's a process of abstracting from use value when commodities exchange. Chris Arthur rephrases this to say that value is constituted by the determinate negation which is supplied by use value. A determinate negation which is supplied by use value. Now, you could go weird on this and say, well, maybe that's what masturbation is, but then that's a whole nother set of stories. In the exchange process, value is an empty form with no more than a negative kind of existence, simply defined as an absence of the use value dimension of the commodity. Thus, what is constituted in the process of exchange is pure form, the mere form of exchangeability. That is the possibility or expectation of exchange, which seems pretty pure because it's in your head. Despite this unpromising start, the pure empty form of exchangeability is the center of a dynamic process by which value form first finds an almost immaterial form of expression in money. So, the desire for money is also similar to the desire for stuff. A further stage enables value as money to convert itself into the next thing, capital. As money capital, it is able to transform itself into full reality as a means of production and labor by a vampire-like absorption of living labor. It's able to grow and establish social domination. That's kind of the power that, Foucault's talking about. Starting as pure form, value transforms itself into the material reality of a self-perpetuating system, but one which remains essentially determined by the initial emptiness of the value form. So that's, life and death, reproduced. You need to have Renfeld, you need Renfeld. You can't have Dracula without a Renfeld, right? Hegel's systemic dialectical development of categories is directed towards articulating the structure of totality, showing how it supports itself through the interchange of its inner moments. So this is not external, but internal. I argue, this is Kincaid here, I argue capital is such a totality. The impersonal abstractness of Hegel's logic and the patterns of necessity which define its structure can express and explain the domination of humanity by an economic system which is driven by profitability and sheer accumulation. Therefore, capitalism, in its essence, is a form-determined system. Here's how Chris Arthur interconnects the systematic dialectic with value form theory. So you're connecting systematic dialectic with value form theory. Value has made itself real, actual, and expanding. The real material world of production and use values has become dominated by capital operating like a powerful thing, an automaton. It just this is cool. Double entry bookkeeping. Interest, double compounding interest stuff. Here, evidently, is what Chris Arthur is offering as a particular version of a much larger class of accounts of capital, those which stress reification and commodity fetishism. Now, recall what these two ideas are, right? Some things are reified because, you begin to see it gains a kind of presence in the market or reality, and commodity fetishism is, of course, what the advertising people do. They make you want stuff. And it has particular meaning, even though it's not, you don't necessarily have it in front of you. The 6 contributions to this symposium, so this Kincaid article is part of 6 articles to a symposium on this stuff, and are wide-ranging and diverse in their coverage. I note here only 3 of the themes, so there's only 3 of 6, that are given detailed attention in the discussions which follow. So, number 1, value form treated in isolation from labor and production. That alone is reification and problematic, of course, but you sort of have to follow along here. Patrick Murray, while endorsing much in Chris Arthur's theorization, offers a detailed rebuttal of 2 elements in Chris Arthur's reconstruction of Marx. The first one is A, that Marx was mistaken and unrigorous when, at the start of Capital, he introduced labor as the source of value. The second one is B, that Marx did not justify the fact that in the early sections of Capital, he confines his discussion only to commodities produced by labor. Murray rejects Chris Arthur's treatment of exchange in isolation from production and his contention that value form has no content when initially determined in the exchange process. So these are contingencies about how is it that you measure this stuff, or this is the congealing problem. An even broader attack on Chris Arthur's exchange-determined value form is mounted by Jacques Bidet. Yes, it's that same Bidet. He challenges Chris Arthur's argument, that commodity production is not, or at least should not be, examined by Marx until the category of capital is introduced in part 3 of volume 1. This is a big argument for people who focus only on like the first chapter of volume 1 of Karl Marx's Capital. There's like a lot of arguments about this. And of course, it's stupid because, volume 1 is constructed from a whole bunch of different things. And yes, certain things have more emphasis than others. And there's a point at which either Marx or Engels decides, well, we've got to front load this thing because we're not going to get, we're not going to get 6 books done. We're not even get 3 books done. Let's kind of front load it and get some stuff in there so people who only read volume 1 can sort of see where we're headed. And you just sort of have to, be patient. Some stuff just doesn't get fully explained in the first volume. And yeah, this sounds like biblical studies, but you just gotta hang in there, right? On the contrary, and correctly says Bidet, in the first sections of Capital, value is discussed in relation to a general account of the commodity form of production. Marx starts with commodity production and with market relations. The latter involve private property, the division of labor, production for exchange, concrete and abstract labor, and average socially necessary labor time, SNALT, as identified by the market. Bidet argues that it is vital to see that the market is not by necessity capitalist. And that's, if you just look at history, pre-capitalist history, there are markets. Get over it. There's usury as well. So that's a whole other set of questions. Chris Arthur's identification of market with value forming capitalism is also challenged strongly by Ian Hunt, who invokes debates about the work of Rawls and Nozick, John Rawls, Charles Nozick, right? To suggest that non-competitive variants of market relationships are possible and should not be excluded, as Chris Arthur does, as a matter of definition. Non-competitive variants of market relationships are possible. This is the issue of this is the issue of pre-capitalist formations, pre-capitalist arrangements, because in some sense, you need to get a sense of what that might be. You know, classless society, don't need money. You know, what happens in post-capitalism, right? Don't need money, right? You know, to each according to their need, blah, 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 blah. Neither Hunt nor Bidet are defending the market as it operates in capitalism, but in different but salutary ways. Both of them are questioning the Chris Arthur's commodity fetishist position. That is, any system of market exchange must involve the ontological emptiness of the value form. You know, yes or no, and should this falsify the argument? System is a key concept in Chris Arthur, but when is the dialectical account of it complete? That's another issue. Chris Arthur's systematic dialectic requires the specification of a totality. Now, this idea of a totality is challenged in all kinds of other literature, so totality is a interesting but contingent term. Alex Kalinikos argues that the circular method, which Chris Arthur adopts from Hegel, depends crucially for its scientific coherence on clarity about when the totality has been defined in sufficient detail. Reconstruction of reality, which the dialectic carries out, must, as Chris Arthur writes, take for granted what it is headed for is logically complete. Okay. On what basis, asks Kalinikos, could we judge that the whole system of categories is complete and internally self-sustaining? This is a logical question, and it's a formal question in some ways. In Kalinikos's view, Chris Arthur has simply launched himself on a process without any logical point of conclusion. The inevitable consequence of a method which seeks knowledge through logical derivation and not by creative explanation of the historical realities of economic and social development. So that's always going to be an argument under historical materialism. You're always going to have these challenges to, well, that's a perfectly reasonable formal thing, but doesn't work in historical practice, or it's difficult to empirically prove that it ever happened, etc. Kalinikos is also troubled by Chris Arthur's endorsement of Enrique de Selve's claim that living labor is exterior to the capital relation. This is that trying to, labor and capital relation. Living labor, as the source of value, lies outside this self-referring circle of value forms. So there's this whole business about segregating the abstraction from the concrete. Okay? And you see this in other formulations, like the difference between labor and labor power is exactly that same kind of example. By thus externalizing exploitation and by a corresponding neglect of competition, Arthur downplays the relationality of capital and thereby leaves the real structure of the world uncomprehended. Bidet, though in a cautious way, resumes a number of Althusserian themes. So you already know where this is coming from, right? This is 60s and 70s French post-war thought. He suggests that Chris Arthur has led to a misleading concept of the system by a use of a Hegelian systematic dialectic with its uniform, univocal pattern of development, the unfolding of an expressive totality. So that's worth arguing about as well. Bidet argues that it is crucial to make a distinction between structure and system, as some people wouldn't, and that Chris Arthur's totalizing version of dialectical development makes it impossible to explain tendencies which affect the structure. You can see there's a logical fallacy in there, and I'll leave it to you to figure that out. Use value marginalized. Robert Albritton and Jim Kincaid, same Jim Kincaid who writes this article, concur, though using a very different very different lines of argument that Marx's starting point, and correctly so, the commodity as a contradictory unity of use value and exchange value. That's, sort of a dialectic assumption at the front end. Chris Arthur's initial absenting of use value and materiality in favor of value form, this is the difference between the abstract and the concrete, right? And the reintroduction of use value at a later point have the effect of making contradiction secondary and external to the capitalist mode of production. Well, yes and no. Let me just break there for a second and remind you that some of the argument here is only about the Department 1 to Department 2, realizing that moment between Department 1 and Department 2 is only one moment in a chain of Department 1s and Department 2s. But anyway, Albritton also argues that there's incoherence. There is incoherence in the way in which Chris Arthur introduces class struggle into his value form theory. And that you could argue that, of course, maybe too soon. It is not clear whether Chris Arthur believes that the laws of motion of capital are determined by the law of value or by class struggle at the point of production. You see, that's more problems. In Albritton's view, the category of the class struggle should be treated at a more concrete level of analysis than that of value theory. This is that, it's history versus not history at some moment. In his reply to these and other criticism, Chris Arthur has clarified and strongly defended the arguments in his book. In leaving him with the last word in this particular symposium, the editors expressed the hope that future issues of historical materialism will publish further discussions to the many important questions which have arisen in the current debate. There's a lot to work out through, and worth writing an article and blah 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 blah. Let's not worry about that for the moment, even though, as I think you can see, there's certain fallacies or inconsistencies or problems of premise that were there even in the thing above. Now, I present to you the standard meter bar. In 1799, a platinum iridium meter bar was used to define meter. That is the original type from which all meters evolved are derived. In other words, you have the standard meter. There is a standard meter somewhere. And, there's several things like this in various places. Something perhaps that doesn't move around so much in temperature, et cetera, et cetera. Now, another way that you can measure meters, the standard meter, if you assume metric system, since 1983, meter is defined using the speed of light. That is 299,792,458 meters per second. The meter is the length of the path traveled by light in vacuum during a time interval of 1 over 299,792,458 of a second. I just leave that there. Because, in fact, that is the substance of a value form problem. In other words, you have the physical ideal meter, right? You just sort of assume that, well, let's all measure all the other yardsticks against this sucker, the meter sticks. And, what is it that we would, how is it that we would measure? And then you have this other thing, which is not quite, it's measurable, clearly. But it is also something which requires a shit ton of measurement of instrumentation. That's a whole nother set of questions, but we'll leave that for another lecture. Marx, Hegel, and the value form. This is an article from, and you can get this on Chris Arthur's website. The link is there. He does a whole bunch of stuff. A lot of arm waving going on. Chris Arthur is one of a whole bunch of other people, and acknowledged by people like Andy Higginbottom, who we've been looking at Capital Volumes 1, and now we're in Volume 2, which should come out this week, maybe even yesterday. No, Monday. Anyway, the point being is that we're going to get to this eventually, and Arthur is part of the community of scholars subscribed to by a variety of folks, as you can see, and including Higginbottom. So we need to sort of get that's sort of there too. We know that Higginbottom has accepted certain premises that actually Arthur, Chris Arthur believes. So now we're going to look at Chris Arthur himself because, it was getting too meta for a while. And so let's look at him and his writings itself. And needless to say, we're just at the beginning of this process, and I'm going to try and get to the end of this, partially because it's to work it out for myself, as in talking therapy, but also to understand that this kind of question, the question that I initially started with on the intersection of things like indexicality, sublation, and valorization, are part of this exact same problem. They do not signify it, they do not stand for it, they represent several of the kinds of underlying issues that go on with explicating a value form argument. And whether you decide it's useless or useful, and without getting to that point, because I'm not there yet, certainly, there's other stuff I got to read. I got to read the new translation by the two Pauls. I've got to read this other new book that is really seriously crazy, but important. And probably by the time I get to the end of this little research project, I will have a book. I'm pretty sure I will. I definitely have a chapter in a book at some moment, and I would like to have that done in the next month or two. And that's kind of where I'm headed with this. Not that I can always follow my own directives. Okay. Marx, Hegel, and the value form. It is generally recognized that of all the chapters of Marx's Capital, it is the first chapter of Volume 1 in which the subterranean influence of Hegel's science of logic and of its categories is easily detectable. That's not very controversial. However, this observation has not been much supported by detailed accounts of just which categories are relevant, and it is about categories. The present chapter reconstructs, that's this little article here by Chris Arthur, reconstructs the dialectic of the value form in order to show how Hegel's categories illuminate it. After initial analysis of the commodity using Hegel's categories of being, that is quality, quantity, and measure, this is ontic questions. The remaining categories deployed are drawn from Hegel's doctrine of essence because the opposition's characteristic of its structure are suited to a study of the doubling of the commodity into commodities and money. Okay, this little expression here, doubling of the commodity into commodities and money. This is the move, as we saw in the little cleaver diagram, of going from money to money commodity to money. These comprise essence and appearance, reflection and the determinations of reflection. Let's think about a mirror, right? Namely, identity, difference, contradiction, and ground. All of those things are part of reflection. And if you look at it in math, geometric sort of analysis, that's exactly what it is. It's identity, difference, contradiction, and ground. And then you could go further off and talk about Lacan and a bunch of other things, but we won't do that here. Positing this presupposition, the inverted world, right? The camera obscura, force and expression, actuality, together with its modal categories and substance. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff there. We're not going to do it all here, but you can see that there's things to look at. This present discussion of Marx's first chapter is part of a broader project of mine to provide a systematic, dialectical reconstruction of the categories of his capital. Systematic dialectic is a method of exhibiting the inner articulation of a given whole. Science, in treating such a totality, must elucidate a set of categories capturing the forms and relations constitutive of the totality in an ordered presentation. It's a lot there, but important to remember what that means, what that is, why he's being systematic. So one of the points here is there's a significant homology between the movement of exchange, generating a system of pure forms of value, all abstracted from the natural specificity of commodities, and the movement of thought generating Hegel's system of logical categories, all abstracted from the real material world. So the point is that there is some connection between the ideal world of, Hegelian sort of cogitating here and an actual world, right? That's the thing that Marx inverts, right? the Feuerbach, blah, blah, blah. Moreover, the form of value as such, which springs from exchange as a process of abstraction, may be analyzed regardless of any labor content. This is that important moment of exchange and labor content and its relation as an abstraction to a labor theory of value. Indeed, theoretical priority must be accorded to form analysis because it is the practice of exchange that establishes this necessary form of social synthesis in the first place before labors expended are commensurated in it. So something exists before labor. Now, it could be just that moment, you're still swinging the hammer before it hits the nail. So there's stuff going on, and you need to sort of be open to that idea. Here, then, I analyze the value form as such, bracketing the origins of the objects of exchange. Now, and note, he has footnotes that are, cross-reference all this stuff. So he's been thinking about this for a while. He's not doing this in a slapdash way. Whereas Hegel abstracts from everything through the power of thought, exchange abstracts only from what is presented to it, a delimited sphere of use value. So the dialectic of capital is less general than Hegel's in scope, but within its own terms, equally absolute, insofar as it is founded on all-round abstraction to leave quasi-logical forms of being of commodities. But the value form of the commodity is not an axiom or an empirical given upon which all else depends. The originating form gains actuality and truth only when grounded in the totality to which it gives rise through a dialectical logic. So the underlying premise here is that unlike Hegel, who would much prefer to, just cogitate on this stuff, there is some set of relations that to the real world that is going on, that is dialectical. However, I go further than just drawing attention to methodological lessons from Hegel's systematic ordering of categories. This is what the Hegel's system of logic is about, science of logic is about, as do others. I draw also on his ontology. Hegel, and this is why there's all that Cambridge, well, not why, but there is this Cambridge stuff on social ontology, which we were looking at before. That's kind of why it's there. Hegel shows how an ideality builds itself up moment by moment into a self-actualizing totality, an absolute. Now, there's lots of stuff in there, and we'll come back to that, I suppose. If then, as I believe capital has in part an ideal reality, then if it can be shown to incarnate Hegel's blueprint, it may be self-sustaining in the same way. That's a hypothesis there, right? Hegel's logic can be drawn on in such a study because capital is a very peculiar object grounded in a process of practical abstraction and exchange in much the same way as Hegel's dissolution and reconstruction of reality as is predicated on the abstractive power of thought. There's a lot there, but it is to presume that we sort of project a place in the world and kind of there's stuff there that we draw back and project onto our reality. Abstraction is out there. Conversely, I interpret Hegel's self-actualizing idea as the ontological specific capital because it has relevance only to a system of self-moving abstractions. So there's some presumption that, it's not static. There's some dynamic element here, and that's kind of part of why we're doing this. In general, I have no problem with the system of categories such as Aristotle and Kant articulated, but I believe Hegel's view of system is peculiar in that he claims, quote unquote, the concept is a self-acting author of its own forms. I say the same of capital. So you have a categorical element, you have projection, you have capital and labor or labor there that are possible. Just as Hegel holds that thinking itself, devoid of personality, is the productive subject, so I take capital as a productive subject devoid of personality. It is as if Hegel, in his philosophy, absolutized the specific dialectic of capital, although his factual knowledge of fully functioning capital is gained secondhand in his readings of classical political economy in the English newspapers. That's why you read The Philosophy of Right by Hegel before you read Marx, because he's kind of thinking about this stuff but from a specific kind of historical point of view. However, in a short chapter such as this, I cannot do more than demonstrate that Hegel's logic illuminates the categories of Marx's first chapter. So here we see that, yeah, Hegel's there. It's in the first chapter. That's why we got to do it. And that is why there are multiple books on the first chapter of the first volume of Capital, Karl Marx's Das Kapital. So I think this, yes. What is the starting point of capital? Does its movement follow the method of rising from abstract determinations to the concrete whole, as outlined in Marx's unpublished 1857 introduction? A lot of people use that to determine all kinds of things about capital, etc. The 1857 introduction to the Critique of Political Economy. The concrete as the unity of diverse determinations is then the result, not the starting point. I covered some of this ground in this is Chris Arthur talking about in his 2004 writing. That treatment used an apparatus taken from Bertrand Russell's theory of relations. The dialectical exposition presented here is better. But the development of the systematic dialectic beyond that of this chapter, see, this is something he wrote 5 years later, Chris Arthur 2009, which takes the argument to the general formula for capital on the basis of Hegel's doctrine of the concept. And that's kind of moving in an interesting way. And yes, if you're a post-Keynesian, you might actually get interested in that. Or did Marx reject this in beginning Capital with a concretum, as he says in his notes on Adolf Wagner, namely the commodity? Because wealth presents itself to us immediately as a heap of commodities. That is, people like, rich people have, multiple yachts or multiple cars or blah, blah, blah. Confusion on this point is resolved by taking account of two different meanings of abstract and concrete. You see, we're still there with abstract and concrete. We're still within the, as we mentioned with Kleber, the kind of overall structural argument. Marx speaks in his preface to Capital of the power of abstraction by analogy with the microscope because it yields the quote unquote economic cell form, the commodity. Now, this gets us into a whole bunch of other things that, this is Bellamy Foster, blah, 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 about science and biology and all that other, metabolic stuff. Here, the abstract means that which is taken apart from the whole that supports it and within which it gains its meaning. It is separated off from it, but especially if the commodity is not understood as mediated in the whole, it may be taken in immediate experience as concrete in the sense of tangible. So what we see is a kind of sense of difference between things that we know that are in front of us, but we need instruments like microscopes to extend our perception. That is, we need technology like a microscope to extend our ontological investigations. That is to extend our place in the world. And yes, I will insert in this moment my little analogy, my lecture analogy to parking cars and microscopes versus telescopes and blah, blah, blah. However, a more usual sense of the abstract is that which results from the most general way of thinking about anything, achieved by leaving aside all its specific characteristics so as to generate a simple immediacy for thought, namely a pure category, not susceptible to analysis, as is the concrete, of course. So this idea of categories, what is it that we have to sort of look at? Well, maybe heuristically, we have to look at something that is pure and that not as confused, as it were, by other things, other matters. If this distinction is accepted, so this is about the premises of the argument, then we observe that capital has two beginnings. And this is important, and it's Kantian, the analytic and the synthetic or systematic. And that's a whole other article there. Capital is the object, but this is analyzable into the movement of money, and money mediates commodity exchange. So all of those things that we were talking about before, that is, there's capital, but remember, we've talked about dynamic elements that money moves. It does. And money mediates as well. That is, you can't have exchange unless the money moves, right? It just seems relatively simple, but I don't think it's a bad assumption. It's unreasonable assumption. Thus, capital begins from the commodity and further analyzes it into two aspects: its usefulness and its exchangeableness. So this is use value, exchange value, right? Just go back to the cleaver diagram. Well, usefulness remains a standing condition of commodity exchange. You go to the store, can I use this damn thing which is on sale? Exchangeableness cannot be reduced to it, but is a social determination that follows its own law. Well, maybe I could resell this, or maybe if I fix this, I could resell it to somebody, or maybe I'll just use it and make whatever this other thing I want to do better. The value form is the abstract starting point for a systematic dialectical development of the concrete whole of capitalist production articulated in terms of the totalizing concept of value. So value is there. In other words, I come in contact with this shit and this, there it is. It's sitting on the sale table, clearance table. It has some value for me. I project that I may be able to get even more value out of this for X number of reasons. Although our analytical starting point, namely the commodity produced by capital, appears as a concrete one, the practical abstraction imposed in exchange from every given feature of it leads to a systematic dialectic of pure form homologous with the pure thoughts of Hegel's logic. Now, that move to systematic dialectic of pure form homologous with the pure thoughts of Hegel's logic, that's a big leap because I know people in reality who don't think like that, and they're just idiots. But I think they're idiots. They may be the most brilliant people in the world, but sometimes they behave in ways that assure me that they are idiots. But anyway, that's another story. The forms of value. This is the first section in Chris Arthur's article on Hegel, Marx, and value theory. The forms of value, number one, the commodity. This first section thematizes what it is to be a commodity. This is value in the shape of being, sein or sein, as in Dasein, blah, blah, blah. The first domain of Hegel's logic and its determinations here also follow those in the logic itself, namely quality, quantity, and measure, to which correspond in our case, it will be seen, exchangeableness, magnitude, and exchange value. So you see you have new things that are part of this. So this is, and he proves here in the Hegel 1991, 1817 version of the logic, science of logic, that is equally both a synthetic and an analytic beginning. The foundation of the systematic presentation of the categories of capital is that the value form is a pure form imposed on products without expressing any material content given in them. In other words, or in one way of thinking about it, is that it's all, it could be out of your, from your mind. It could be, you could be out of your mind. But this is this idea of what counts as a form. And you can see where this goes in terms of psychoanalytic stuff and whatever, but that's another story. All the bodily characteristics of the commodity are abstracted from within exchange. This leaves the being of exchange void of any determinacy whatsoever, yet there is something there. Dasein, as I just mentioned, is Hegel's term. There's something there. For if it is the movement of exchange which makes this being present, then that being does, after all, have a determination, namely the bare quality of exchangeableness. So, there's something there. I think I may be able to do something with it. I may be able to sell it for something or exchange it for something. And so that's kind of going on there. So exchangeableness is also usefulness in that sense, which anything appearing in exchange must have. I distinguish this from exchangeability, which is value in a measurable sense. So you have two things here, exchangeableness and exchangeability. The exchangeableness is, it has something going on there that is value related. But exchangeability means I've actually translated it in some dollar form or whatever. That doesn't mean it absolutely, but you can see the distinction between being exchangeable and, then moving to the actual moment of exchange. And if you get that sense, that's kind of what Heinrich is kind of dealing with. And the same thing that Moseley talks to Heinrich about, that, it's exchange and I need to work out what one is the other thing. And I think that Arthur asks that question that Moseley asks of Heinrich, but that's just me. How does something prove that it has exchangeableness? This requires the commodity to have others against which it may exchange. It is only insofar as the commodity is translated into a second commodity that its exchangeableness is demonstrated. This is the idea of difference, right, that is pursued by all kinds of other people for other reasons. Difference. But that this exchangeableness has yet been retained and not dissipated in its realization is shown if the second commodity, the thing you compare it to, note that a second commodity could be something that has a mirror-like relation. The exchange against a third commodity is shown if the second commodity in turn proves itself of worth through being exchanged against a third commodity, and so on. First, second, third, fourth, X number of commodities. An ever-changing series of commodities passes through our hands endlessly, a spurious infinity. You can imagine that, right? It's pretty easy. A system of bartering or trades, which gets us to something else. But a genuine infinity is posited when the other commodities are grasped only as complementary forms of the first in a closed system in which all commodities refer back to each other. So this is an important question. Is it a closed or open system? Right? Let's move on, because there's a difference. The commodity returns to itself, having been presented in its other, but it is one and the same in both cases. When the exchangeableness of a commodity is brought back to it, the commodities gain being for itself. Every commodity is now characterized as in itself. It's not just exchangeableness, but it becomes exchangeable. So there's this kind of transformational moment, right? Mediated moment. However, in Hegel's logic, the being for self, thus developed, is problematic. It is one which excludes other ones. You see, you've already sort of totalized it. The many, which excludes other ones, the many, yet is not distinguishable from them. In their mutual definition, they are all one and the same, having no inner specificity. Hegel argues that their separateness is sustained, therefore, only by their continual repulsion of one another, a process of reciprocal excluding. Now, that's a little bit more about Hegel's physics, but you can say that, for example, and this is a bad analogy, but Brownian motion might be that thing, but that's for another set of thinking. The one determines its being through the negative relation to other such ones, the many, yet its identity with its others necessarily connects it indissolvably to its others. This relation is a force of attraction, Hegel says. So, there's physics going on here of one kind or another. Here I leave aside this is the footnote for this. Here I leave aside the subtleties of being and nothing. For that, see chapter 8 of Arthur, 2002. There I show that considering the commodity, although what is not value is, of course, use value, it is wrong to identify nothing and use value. Rather, being and nothing, and yes, you can get your copy of Sartre out. This is the same issue. Are moments of value, defining itself negatively. Value simply is the absence of use value, which becomes its own positive presence, so to speak. Now, you may think that, Hegel's being nuts here, but this kind of set of questions is actually a fairly important question, even more important. And if you're thinking of Sartre in the context of existentialism, et cetera, and, why that is important, but that's another story. In our case, what do repulsion and attraction mean? An exchangeable commodity is valid only through another, that is attraction. But for them to be distinct exchangeables, the requirement of numerical difference must be sustained. that is repulsion. You know, I can't have too many of those damn things. I only need one of those, whatever. It is so here by the distinct material bearers of commodities. Moreover, while the exchange relation identifies the sides as substitutable, you know, doesn't matter which one you take, its polarity preserves the moment of repulsion at the same time. So there is some aspect to it which is different or determinative than the other. So here the dialectic of repulsion and attraction realizes one commodity in another very abstractly, not another of different quality except in use value, of course, but simply an other identical to the first. I won't get into the thing. Kant has a whole thing on this. Anyway, as exchangeables, commodities are of exactly the same quality. And although many are present, so these things on the clearance table, this merely numerical difference does not form the kind of limit that marks off two qualitatively different things. You know, if I have a second one of these things, what am I going to use that one for? This will be important later. We have now established the commodity as one among many. But the many, that is all these things on the clearance table, as a whole, determined as one, so to speak, raises the question, well, how many make it up? I mean, what if I want to build another atom bomb? Am I going to have enough stuff to do it? But it does not matter. The quality of exchangeableness does not change into another quality, no matter how many commodities are at play in this network. This means quantity is a determination external. This is the Hegelian idea here to quality. Now, the difference between quality and quantity is, of course, you can't, it's too difficult to divide them up. And in fact, that's the whole point of Hegel, right? And the idea that negation helps us to work through why that is. The articulation of the substructure of the category of quantity I use here broadly follows Hegel in that the main divisions are a conflation of those he gives in the Science of Logic and his encyclopedia. The encyclopedia is a smaller, but probably better written version of the Science of Logic. There are two. There's the big logic, the Science of Logic, and the little Science of Logic, which is in his collection called the Encyclopedia, which is written later. Pure quantity, quantum, and ratio. The vindication of my category of value as pure quantity follows from the fact that the quantity of exchangeables has no inherent limit. Every exchangeable relates to putatively infinite others. Equally, the many considered as determinate consists of discrete ones. Every one has to be determined as an exchangeable item if exchange is to be possible. Now, you can think of algorithms in that way as opposed to an object in and of itself. So that's an interesting question under which you could talk about blockchain and a bunch of other stuff. It is not enough for the commodities to be specified as having properties that make them exchangeable in a general indeterminate sense. A determination is required that allows for discrete exchangeables to be presented for exchange. In other words, a commodity must be specifiable as an item for sale. It has to specify itself in discrete units, each of which, the quantum, announces itself as an instantiation in delimited form of the good concerned. So, is that the price that is marked on the thing? Will you sell it to me on the price that it was marked on the clearance table? A baker does not sell bread, but a loaf of such and such a weight. Only thus does sale become determinate. In other words, you don't sell the abstract quality, the thing called bread, but you actually sell a loaf of whatever it is, cut or uncut, raisins or no raisins, etc. The value category of quantum must be modeled in its bearers, which must be countable items. A baker has to specify such a unit as a 1 pound loaf, for example. A commodity must be delimited as an exchangeable, for instance, a loaf to be an example of a commodity. Yet this limit is equally sublated. Remember, we had sublation all the way above when I was talking about it. Yet this limit is equally sublated, since any number, for instance, of loaves may be taken as together exchangeable, since if one is, all the many identical ones taken together are two. And this is Hegel talking das Eins. If two things are identical in all aspects, they may be said to be the same damn thing. However, if they are nonetheless countable as two, they are said to be numerically different, right? Number one is different from number two. I know that just seems a little tedious, but that's kind of an important idea. And back to Chris Arthur article, chapter. Because it's rare for commodities to be exchangeable one for one, room is to be made for the commodities related to be numerous in order for a number of units of one commodity to exchange against another number of units of another. What happens at scale? That's the question I've been raising the last couple of days. What happens when you have too many of these damn things? Exchangeable commodities then take determinate shape in a delimited quantity, yielding the category of magnitude defined as a number of units. The striking thing about this quantification is that although each good has its own natural index of magnitude, it's weighs a certain, it's when you buy cheese, right? It's never all this, they're not all the same weight. They may appear to be, but you start measuring, they're not all the same weight. In terms of which haggling goes on, these commodities seem unable to refer to any common index of exchangeableness because hypotheose, as naturally diverse goods, their index of amount differs absolutely. No one exchanged 2 pounds of gold for 2 pounds of iron. Now, that's, of course, the more radical example, but Marx does give it, right? Are 2 pounds of gold equal to 2 pounds of iron? Or are 2 pounds of gold equal to 2 pounds of rhodium, for example? Even more crazy. Here, magnitude is a pure number and yields a ratio of such numbers. This is why Marx is into the ratios, because it allows him to explain this in ways that don't get too nuts. I'll give you 6 of these for 4 of those as the quantitative form of the offer of full exchange. Brought into unity with itself this way as reflexive magnitude, or as reflexive, magnitude passes over into the ratio of quanta. Thus, in our case, the number of units of one commodity with respect to the number of units of another commodity is the quantitative bearing on one exchangeable of another. Magnitude, thus related to itself in such a ratio of quanta, is the being for itself of quantity, in that the ratio is the manner in which a quantum relates to itself, having passed through the other related quantum. A bit much, but that's what it means. Measure, that is specifying measure, Hegel defines as a qualitative quantity. Troubling there, right? I divided into rules, series of specific measures, and unity of measure relations. Quality and quantity are unified here in the sense that the ratio implicitly reinstates quality only if it remains the same while its terms alter. So, Marx is following Hegel along here and trying to say, well, this is how we relate these things that are at a distance, that aren't quite measurable, to each other. And, we do this in a variety of ways, and that's why physics does what it does. When there is the reiterated identity of its quotient, we have a magnitude that retains its quality, regardless of this external variation in the quanta so related. Unless you think that that's unimportant, measuring qualities of planetary moons has that peculiar problem. At one moment in the history of telescopes, the moons were the same. Well, now we know they aren't quite so same. In fact, they're quite different. Moons of other planets. In our case, measure is exchange value. This depends on the presence of a stable rate of exchange that one commodity has against another. If this is so, then a rule is operating. Pro rata exchange has a qualitative character because it remains the same regardless of the increase or decrease in the number of commodity units related in it. And this is why, Marx should have been thinking about double entry bookkeeping and compound interest. The key point about this is that the ratio abstracts from the specific items involved. If, in this rate of exchange, 2 of A exchange against 3 of B and 4 of A against 6 of B, it is clear that a rule is being followed. Considered as a result, such passing over the one side to the other gives the commodity its specific measure. Its exchange value, what it amounts to, so to speak, is specified in something other than itself. However, every rate of exchange taken by a commodity differs for each commodity related to the given commodity. However, every rate of exchange taken by a commodity differs. Every commodity related to the given commodity. Thus, its exchange values are so many measures, yielding a series of specific measures of exchange values, specifying it in different ways. 2 for a nickel, 3 for a dime, whatever. I now turn aside to discuss Hegel on real measure, das reale Maß. Hegel's treatment of measure in his Science of Logic is too long and confused, but in the encyclopedia, remember I mentioned, it is too short. So, split the difference. My treatment of measure in this section is closer to the abbreviated account in Hegel's encyclopedia than it is to the longer discussion in his Science of Logic, in which he distinguishes real measure from specifying measure. At this point, then, it's necessary to discriminate between them and to discuss precisely what is covered by the category of measure here. And in the Science of Logic, the big logic, Hegel develops the category of specifying measure in which something is measured by something else. In our case, the exchange value of one commodity is given in terms of another in order to derive real measure. Now, I think Hegel's argument is very dubious because I have no space here to show this. It seems to me that real measure is not a surface category characteristic of being, but a category of essence, for it measures a supposed immanent magnitude. Here, then, I'm concerned only with specifying measure, yet we still have available to us the category of real measure to deploy further on, precisely when we reach the category of value as essence presented in money. So, yes, there's something problematic going on here and gets more complicated considering what you're trying to measure. To resume, the members of this indefinite series of measures cannot here be measuring different qualities of the commodity because exchangeableness is a unitary determination. Thus, if a measurable is present, it must exist in a form that is indifferent to all the specific exchange values, which are all equivalents of one another as its measures. So, okay, you come up to the clearance table and they all have the same package, but there's less stuff in one package than others because, that's why you put it on the clearance table. Why, because somebody, removed something and therefore, alters the situation of this particular thing. But by all external packaging, it looks the same as the other one, or it is identified as such. And then therefore, if you're buying X of one thing, it's sort of not all the same X, whatever. All these specific measures being valid, they are substitutable. So we reach the notion that there must be some unity to them, that although they're all different exchange values of a commodity, they must represent the same measurable. In my argument, the series of specific measures plays a role superficially similar to that of Hegel's nodal line of measures in generating the transition to essence. So it is worth explaining our different strategies here. Hegel develops the category of the nodal line, N-O-D-A-L line, from his consideration of the way in which quantitative changes in a thing eventually give rise to a qualitative change. Every new quality will have its own proper measure, of course, hence such changes in succession generate a nodal line of measures. He argues that these changing qualities nevertheless have the same permanent substratum indifferent to them in their measures. This is measureless in Hegel's peculiar terminology. In this indifference to measure, he sees the becoming of essence. In our case of a single quality, namely exchangeableness, remains the same, however large or small the number of commodities related as exchangeable. But when the commodity is considered quantitatively, namely in terms of its exchangeability, it has many measures as its exchange value is specifiable in terms of many other commodities. So, sort of I buy a couple of these things, but the box has one less thingamabob in it. My menu or recipe has, requires a certain number. It's going to screw up what I finally put together. Hopefully get that. My argument then is that we can suppose that there is some common element in this series of measures appearing phenomenally, that is, by appearance, in various external exchange value as such. On fine, I replace Hegel's diachronic line with a synchronic series in order to get my own final term of measure. That is, the unity of measure relations. So you're replacing Hegel's the measureless. The series of specific measures, exchange values taken in this unity, as substitutable ways of creating the measure leads us from the exchange values of a commodity to a unitary measurable, the notion of the immanent exchangeability of a commodity. Of course, this always must be specified in some sort of measure, but is itself indifferent to each and every available specific measure. Immanent exchangeability, I will term value. So finally, we get to value, right? Once we have made the transition to the category of essence, that we speak of value as the essence of the commodity. So it doesn't all become obvious. It becomes more differentiated or properly organized once something else happens. So it requires a series of other things, some of which may have to happen in your head rather than in reality. Before that, it's relevant to examine a false transition in Marx. Our argument goes from the series of exchange values of commodity to the supposition that there is an immanent value taken as the essence of commodity relations. This valid argument is very much like the one Marx advances when he first says exchange value appears purely as a relation, but then considers what is implied if one commodity has many exchange values equivalent to each other. These are mutually replaceable, and hence exchange value must be the mode of expression of a content distinguishable from it. Now, that's a little confusing, but hopefully you get the idea. However, Marx proceeds immediately to a quite different argument, the notorious third thing argument, which I think is lurking in the background. Taking now two commodities, he sets them as equal to each other, hence of identical magnitude, and hence equal to some third thing to which they are reducible. Now that takes us to the same argument of difference and now manifests a third term. Notice the claim that two commodities are equal is very different from the argument that all exchange values of commodity are equivalent to each other. So note that we've differentiated or identified three particulars as opposed to an infinite number of other sets of relations. Marx's reasoning here is defective because it's not yet been shown that the two commodities are of identical magnitude, only that they stand in a relation of exchange. So in other words, you have this whole set of presumptions going on in your head, not realizing that maybe it's not as it appears. Such a presupposed third thing is not yet posited at such an elementary level. It is money that provides, you see, this is where this is the punchline. It's money that provides the necessary community of commodities and which makes possible comparison of their magnitude in a third thing. He wasted all this sort of cogitating about Hegel, and this is the moment at which you could say, oh, okay, we were talking about the commodity money. Now we actually have a thing that is money itself, a third thing. By contrast, here we simply say that if a commodity has many measures, then these measures might all be doing the same thing in different ways. That is, giving a measure of value as such, regardless of any specific measure. To sum up the being of value, exchangeableness is a category of quality. Quantity and measure add to it to yield the category of immanent exchangeability, designating the power of exchange intrinsic to a commodity. Value is its essence. So that's a way in which you could describe the essence of something by it's exchangeability, as opposed to its exchangeableness. The form, we still have a long way to go here. The forms of value, maybe I should stop now because I've been yammering on for quite a long time. What time is it now? Oh my God. Well, let me finish the rest tomorrow. At this particular moment, now that I've been at this for quite a while, I will begin with part 2 of the Chris Arthur article number 2 in this particular reading for today. And there's 2, 3, and 4, and I think there's a 5 actually. And so there's a little more to do. Don't freak out. I did add that missing appendix from the first edition of Marx's Capital, described as value form, that was unincluded or incorporated into subsequent editions. So you can see it in its original form. Now, whether you want to argue that that has some, provenance somewhere else, I don't know what that is, but it's there. It's available online, so it's not like I've invented this or whatever. It is the thing from which many of the structures of this argument, that is, Chris Arthur wrote this thing that I've been reading at great length about, from the overall structure of this appendix that existed for the first edition of Volume 1 of Capital, and is omitted in subsequent editions. So it's on the one hand missing. On the other hand, you argue that it's just been integrated in the ref, so it's not that important. On the other hand, by having it spread out like this, and I can imagine that Marx or Engels looking at this thing probably went, "Oh, damn it! You just talk too much about Hegelian stuff here, and you're going to lose your damn audience." And so, but I am losing the audience, so I'm going to stop for the moment and see whether there are comments, questions, brickbats. No.
I had a question.
Okay, ask away.
Going back to the one of the diagrams, there's this meta scripting between
Oh, yes.
signifier and and signified, I guess.
Yes, yes.
Um, and in that one diagram where it sort of, there's the circles, there's a meta scripting transformation, I guess, in each one of those. I was sort of trying to figure out where it was in each one of those things.
Okay, I put it up here. You can sort of see it. I don't claim to have a total knowledge of what was going on in this particular PowerPoint. This is somebody else's PowerPoint. What was useful to me was that they applied semiotics to what is a way in which you can talk about how it is that coding can be transformed into natural language. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah,
It's a whole presentation, and then it bogs down in a bunch of other commentary on coding language, um, uh, which I will
yeah.
confess I don't know that much about, but I can give
So
you.
a little bit below that, the next diagram, where there's this sort of these, signifier and keep going.
This one.
No, it's by
I'm running out
Cleaver.
of.
Gravity attracts apples, but not rainbows. Below that,
Oh, this one? No.
no, down lower. It's you were almost to it at the one point. It's just below this. Yeah, there you go. That one.
Oh, this one. This is from a different one that is trying to generalize. It's just an introductory set of questions.
No,
What's this?
above that, right above that.
Well,
Just
this one?
yeah, there you go. Yes.
Oh, well, it's all one thing here, right? It's a singular, it has 9 circles. It is Harry
One leads to the
Cleaver's, it's
next
Harry
kind of thing.
Cleaver's diagram for the argument, for the structure of the argument of Marx's Capital Volume 1. So it
Yeah. So I was
starts
trying to
here.
apply that semiotics look at this diagram.
Well, it's not semiotic. I mean, by any means. Well, it's semiotic. Yeah, everything is semiotic, but I mean, it's it's not presented as a semiotic model. It is simply a series of 9 elements. You go commodity, values, form of exchange value, money form, and then you skip down to the second row, money
Yeah.
form, market exchange, money commodity, then money, and then money, the same money. It's the same money. It's this one going down from, second row down to first column, third row. Money,
Yeah.
capital, buying and selling of labor power, class struggle. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So
So,
within that sequence of, those, it's a series. They're tied together one to the
right,
next.
9 things in a
And,
row. Yes.
and within each one, I think there is one of these metascripting sort of things that happens.
Yes. Yes.
And so
Ooh,
I'm curious,
good.
right. So,
Yeah.
okay, good. All right, great. I'll
Oh,
look for
thank you
more
for
about that.
identifying it as such. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. That's what one semiotician would refer to as semiosis. That's, you know,
Mm.
so you would describe it as scripting because the machine is cranking it out. I would say, well, yeah, sure, it's scripting, but it's also an algorithm, and one more specifically. Um,
Yeah.
Now the question is it the same algorithm in each of the 9 things? That's another question. But whatever.
Well, yeah, that it seemed to me on an individual case, that's where a lot of stuff happens in that scripting spot. You know, there's a sort of a transformation, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's kind of where like, you know,
Absolutely.
where the advertisers get us, I guess.
Well, no,
That's
let's
where I'm
not go
headed.
to a couple of those other, PowerPoint slides I used are from people trying to apply the damn thing to marketing. And I would assert that their understanding of semiotics is okay, but there's a certain moment at which doesn't quite work. And probably the thing in my life that, I started working on this decades ago as a problem in as following Baudrillard's argument about what is a political economy of science. And then I sort of left it for a while because I actually had to make money. I actually had to have a job. So I finally sort of come back to it. And you're asking precisely the question I sort of, well, it's the same thing. I've just been putzing around with this question.
Cool. Well, I appreciate we get back to blood again, and cells and the biology. That always
Well, that
like
it
I like that.
biology has semiotics. There's a whole literature for it, actually. I don't want to get bogged down, but there is semiotics and science are quite tied together. There's a variety of literature, most of it European or South American, and it's pretty significant, actually. I mean, it's a little nuts too. I mean, if you take it too far, you sort of ask zoosemiotics, for example, ask some of those kinds of questions. What is it that plants talk to each other? That's the one version, right?
Yeah. Well, this is all, pretty, at least for me, kind of hard to comprehend. It's
Oh
I'm
yeah,
sort of, you know,
I try not to be, too baffled by it. It's not once you start thinking about this stuff, it comes together okay. It's not as people make it. The subsequent interpretation and explanation and science even can actually screw the whole analysis up.
Mhm.
Or people who simply are reactionary about it, right? Like what's his name, Sokol. Oh, it's all bullshit. So I'm going to show what a smarty I am by writing an article that's nothing but bullshit and see if I can get it accepted by a journal. There's several generations of these assholes. Yes, I said assholes. Oh, no, I shouldn't say that. We're still live stream. Sorry.
Grifters.
You little sausage.
I better get off this so I don't get in trouble. But anyway, yes, there are issues. Let me conclude since I've gone on for and yes, I can go on longer than 90 minutes on this stupidity, but let me just say thank you for listening. This is Dis and Dat. Tomorrow I will, of course, not repeat the whole damn thing because it would probably kill me. But tomorrow we will look at, don't worry, I'm not going to cover everything. I've tacked on a bunch of things at the end because I wanted to remind myself to think about those things. But we're 1/4 of, of the way through Chris Arthur's article. And see, here's form 5. We're at form 2. Here's form
Looking
3.
forward to it.
This wasn't so bad there. It's not as bad as you think, but then again, I'm the one in jammer. This is form 2, so we're going to start form 2 tomorrow and finish this up because it'll probably take me an hour to get through the remainder of this at least. Let me thank you for your attention. Let me thank you for your attention on this. This is, I appreciate that somebody, at least one person, had a question at the end of how wacky this is. It actually, you know,
Do nudge theory.
oh,
Do
yes.
nudge theory. Do nudge theory.
Let me just, let me stop sharing.